Hello, everyone. I'm Thea Spanos-Dunphy, and I'm the president of Global Citizen Circle. It's great to see lots of old friends and welcome some new ones. As many of you know, Global Citizen Circle has a long history of gathering together people in diverse backgrounds, age, and perspectives to listen and learn from one another, to gain momentum and motivation to tackle the hard issues of our day. What you all probably don't know is that this month, in fact, in 2 days, Global Citizen Circle marks the 45th anniversary of our first circle, which featured the late Dick Goodwin, speechwriter for both John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and husband to the well-known historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. The title of that circle on February 26, 1974, was America's Future After the Turbulent 60s. Almost a half a century later, we continue the conversation that looks to the future, but examines the past and how we choose to memorialize it. This program today was the brainchild of my good friend and advisor, Bill Batson, who I'd like to introduce to you. Bill is an artist, writer, and activist, as well as a past board member of Global Citizen Circle and currently a trusted advisor to our organization. He's also a trustee of the Edward Hopper House Museum and Study Center, the third vice president of the NIAC branch of the NAACP, and a steering committee member of the People's Panel on Policing in Rockland County, New York. In 2015, Bill chaired a committee that erected a Toni Morrison Society bench by the Rhodes Monument in Nyack, New York, where he lives. So now I'm going to turn things over to Bill to set the context for today's program, and we'll get started. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Theo. Battles over Confederate flags, monuments, and the national anthem persist, suggesting that the issues that were fought over in both the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement remained unresolved. How we confront the symbols embedded in our statues, flags, and anthems will determine the extent of domestic tranquility we can achieve as a nation. Now, I wrote that in a proposal to my colleagues on the Circle Board on December 5th, 2020. When I hit send, I was worried that my word choice may have been alarmist. Well, one day, 1 month, and 1 day later, insurrectionists rallied behind the Confederate flag, storming and desecrating the United States Capitol. Who we commemorate, how we cite these commemorations, and the democratic systems that we employ to engage stakeholders in these decisions have real consequences. As disheartening as the events in the United States Capitol were, it seems we live in a time when inflection points are mere weeks apart. Just 15 days after the flag of the Confederacy was unfurled in the hallowed halls of Congress, a new administration announced that slaveholding Andrew Jackson would be replaced by the abolitionist Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. Now that's symbolism you can take to the bank. We are in a moment in our history when symbolism and representation matter. Which flag you salute, your posture as our anthems are sung, who is heralded in our town squares, and whose profiles adorn our currency are fluid, not fixed questions. 3 of our discussion leaders engage the public in erecting commemorations that celebrate a diverse and historically accurate narrative. They are Dr. Craig Stutman, Associate Professor of History and Public Policy at Delaware Valley University, specializing in public history, social justice and social policy, race and ethnicity in the United States, the Civil War and Reconstruction eras in Pennsylvania history. He currently serves as the chair of the bench by the Rhodes Society. Dr. Tracy Ann Williams is an assistant dean for student support and success at Fordham College at the Lincoln Center. Prior to Fordham, she was recruited, she worked for over 20 years as the senior administrator and faculty at the New School. Her research focuses on mixed race women in modern fiction. She's a life member of the Toni Morrison Society and serves on the selection committee of the Society's Bench by the Road project. Amiri Jeffries was named executive director of King Boston in June 2020. He's a 3-time graduate of UMass Boston and is currently pursuing his PhD through UMass Boston's higher education program. He also serves as a trustee of the UMass system. Our next panelist has led the nation out of the shadows cast by Confederate statues, away from a distorted narrative that limits our growth as a nation. Mayor Mitch Landrieu. Mayor Landrieu is a lawyer, author, speaker, and nonprofit leader, and CNN political commentator. He served as the 61st mayor of New Orleans and gained national prominence for his decision to take down 4 Confederate monuments, earning him the prestigious John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award. In his best-selling book, In the Shadow of Statues, A White Southerner Confronts History, he recounts his personal journey addressing the issues of race and institutional racism that still plague America. Our moderator will be Dr. Ken Nevinson. Dr. Nevinson is the interim dean for the School of Arts and Sciences and professor of history at the Southern New Hampshire University. His research focuses on the interplay of politics, culture, and society from the era of the American Revolution through the American Civil War. We thank you all for joining this most timely discussion, and we are eager to hear your thoughts. But first, we'll see a short video that explores the central role our discussion leaders play in the monumental struggle over civic symbolism.
Went and said to me one morning, I want you to think about something.
I said, what about these statues, man? We need to do something, especially that statue of Lee. There's no reason for him to have a statue in New Orleans. He didn't win anything.
So today I want to speak about why we chose to remove these 4 monuments to the lost cause of the Confederacy, but also how and why this process can move us towards healing and understanding each other. It is self-evident that these men did not fight for the United States of America. They fought against it. They may have been warriors, but in this cause, they were not patriots. These statues are not just stone and metal. They're not just innocent remembrances of a benign history. These monuments celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that it actually stood for. And after the Civil War, these monuments were part of that terrorism, as much as burning a cross on someone's lawn. They were erected purposefully to send a strong message to all who walked in the shadows about who was still in charge in this city. Another friend asked me to consider these 4 monuments from the perspective of an African-American mother or father trying to explain to their 5th grade daughter why Robert E. Lee sat atop of our city. Can you do it? Can you do it? Can you look into the eyes of this young girl and convince her that Robert E. Lee is there to encourage her? Do you think that she feels inspired and hopeful by that story? Do these monuments help her see her future with limitless potential? Have you ever thought that if her potential is limited, yours and my limited potential as well? We all know the answers to these very simple questions. When you look into this child's eyes is the moment when the searing truth comes into focus. This is the moment when we know what we must do, when we know what is right.
Well, it's true. There have been 14 ceremonial benches that the Toni Morrison Society has placed around this country and countries outside our borders. And there are more to come. Because the purpose of their placement, which is remembering the lives and activities of slaves, is not limited to the United States. So when Professor Carolyn Denard and a brilliant collection of scholars, readers, critics, students, founded the Toni Morrison Society, which, by the way, preceded by a few weeks, maybe months, I don't know. How much? Before I won the Nobel Prize. Well, I couldn't have been more delighted with that. But when the bench idea was realized by the Society, I was more delighted. Of the 14 benches placed, and I was not able to visit them all. When I could, I did. I was there at Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, with those gorgeous yellow umbrellas, white dresses. I was at Oberlin, which is close to my hometown in Ohio. I went, Oberlin. And I was in France, Paris, and Martinique. But I have to say the delight of having this particular bench placement to commemorate the life of Cynthia Hestra in my neighborhood is really profound. You know, this area of Rockland County, not all of it, but concentrations in it, is rife with tales of abolitionists and Underground Railroad shelters. So it doesn't surprise me that Cynthia Hestra thrived here. I want to congratulate all those of you who made the ceremony possible, and you certainly made it joyful and eloquent. Thank you.
When the drum roll stops, we'll unveil the 15th bench.
After years of anticipation and planning, the physical creation of a memorial honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King is scheduled to begin this spring.
We anticipate getting that green light in February, into February, March. It's going to take 17 months to fabricate the bronze part of the memorial.
Amiri Jeffries is the executive director of King Boston, the private nonprofit that to date has raised $9.5 million for the monument that will be installed in the Common near the site of the 1965 rally and march led by Dr. King.
Where are spaces that BIPOC, Black and Brown communities can feel safe? Where can they be? And so it's symbolic that a monument in the center of our oldest park in our financial heart, that there is a space that symbolizes that this is a place that you're welcomed in Boston.
The monument called The Embrace will acknowledge the King's connection to Boston, where the two met while students in the 1950s, but just as important as honoring the past is looking towards the future and the changes happening across the country and here in Boston.
It's probably one of the first memorials post-pandemic, post-racial reckoning, tearing memorials down that's being erected in the country. So I think it's a big deal for Boston, but I think potentially for the nation as well.
Thank you, Bill, for that introduction, and thanks for the film. Welcome, everyone. Before we get into the prompts for the discussants, I just want to remind everyone that we're asking you to put questions or comments in the chat area, and then what's going to happen is that Aaron and I are in a dialogue in another screen, and hopefully I don't get them mixed up, where we'll kind of pull some of those out and then ask you to voice those to the discussion leaders once I've had a chance to kind of lay the groundwork. So please do put your comments in there so that we can circle back and put those into the mix for the conversation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. I want to jump right in. I'll be asking first each of the discussion leaders to address what from their experience and their perspective, were what are a series of maybe sort of inflection points in their own lives that led them to sort of the greater awareness of the need to address the questions around public memorials and the way that we remember the past. At first, I want to put the question to Mayor Landrieu. Mayor, in your book, you refer to this thing you call transformative awareness, right? This sort of journey that you went on, and it's pretty clear that Wynton Marsalis was part of your journey there. We're all a little bit jealous that we don't quite have that kind of a person maybe in our lives, but Wynton Marsalis being part of that transformative awareness for you, bringing you around to the point of action for yourself. Could you speak to this group a little bit of what some of those inflection points were for you and how they kind of coalesced into this moment for you beginning in your second term as mayor, where you began to address the question of the monuments in New Orleans?
Thank you so much for having me. I feel a great sense of gratitude to everybody that's on this call, because I get a sense, although I don't know many of you, that you guys have been involved in this work for quite a long time. And so I want to thank you for laying down some tracks for some of us to follow. Secondly, let me just acknowledge that this battle has been going on since the beginning of time. And one of the reasons it's so difficult is because old wounds about this are still raw, because we've never really confronted it and dealt with it. When we talk about monuments, we're essentially talking about race. We're essentially talking about the idea of America and whether or not we really believe in it, which is that all people come to the table of democracy as equals, and why we haven't lived up to that cause, either in how we remember people who have gone before us or in the policies that we have today. Symbols like monuments and other forms of art really matter, because it says a lot about what we remember, what we revere, and what we don't revere. And it should be clear to everybody now that history isn't told through an equitable lens. You know, these monuments are more than stone and metal. They represent something about who we say we are. And as race continues to be our nation's most traumatic issue, I don't think it's an overstatement. And you saw this with the insurrection at the Capitol, that the future of the country really is at stake. We have to make a decision here in the United States. And of course, these issues are percolating across the world, as some of you know who don't live in the United States right now. If you live in Europe or you live in Asia, you live in other parts of the country, you know that this sense of some people being superior to others has been with us a long time, and is just critically dangerous for the future of the planet as well as for our countries. And I think the insurrection demonstrated to us in pretty clear ways that although all of us on this call are into very aggressively the issue of reconciliation, it's really hard to get to reconciliation until there's truth and accountability. And we are very much in a special moment. Since 2016, when we took the monuments down in New Orleans, through the end of this year, there has been a very aggressive push to get them down in larger numbers than we have in the history. But this is much deeper than that. And so throughout my entire life, I can't remember really a moment in my life when me or my family were not involved somehow in the issue of race. But it really wasn't until I became mayor and we were rebuilding the city of New Orleans, because as you know, we had been destroyed by Katrina. We lost 500,000 homes. I mean, we were literally rebuilding our libraries, our schools, everything. Where my friend Wynton, and by the way, I know he's the greatest trumpet player in the world, but he's just a regular guy from down the street. And he and I have been knowing each other since we were kids. And I had asked him, because I think he is not only a great musician, he's also a great historian, but he's also a great orchestrator, to help me orchestrate the 300th anniversary of New Orleans, which was going to take place in 2018. So the conversation that Wynton and I had took place in 2014. And he just said to me very plaintively, we were having coffee on Convention Center Boulevard the night after he did a concert for the city. He said, man, if you want to rebuild the city, you shouldn't put it back like it was. And I said, well, what are you talking about? And he said, those monuments represent the worst part of our history and their historical lie, and you ought to take them down. And when he said that, the word transformative awareness I wrote in the book came because he hit me it felt like he hit me in the head with a 2x4. And he connected for me what impact the presence of the monuments had to all of the policies that I had been trying to change my whole life, and why the physical spaces and how we curated them And the things that we revered actually either moved us forward and pushed us back. And so the transformative awareness came, that term came from all of a sudden me saying, you know what, something has to change dramatically if we want to actually live the words that we say that we do. And so I use that term in a very intentional, deliberate way because it moved me into action. I used to walk by those monuments, as did many people, black and white, and not really pay much attention to them. But a lot of people did, and some of us weren't aware of that. And so went and said to me, the next thing was, have you ever thought about them from my perspective? And of course, when he said that to me and I started thinking about it, it became obvious to me right away. And I felt very foolish for not having seen it earlier, that those monuments were really a critical message that were being sent primarily to African-American people in the South, definitely across the whole country, that even though the Confederacy had lost the war, they were still in charge of everything relating to what happened in the future. And of course, that's not the story of New Orleans. It's not our history. And essentially, I concluded in a minute that those monuments were a lie, that they will only represent a small part of our history, not all of our history, not told from an equitable perspective. And that if we really wanted to live in truth and integrity, those monuments had to come down if, in fact, the United States of America believed that we were all equal. And of course, we talk one way, we act another. And then we started rolling really into a much more aggressive discussion about implicit bias, institutional racism, and the report that our community did, my organization did, is entitled "Divided by Design." And we basically concluded, which I think is accurate, that we are the way we are in the United States of America because the systems and the institutions are designed this way, either by benign neglect or malignant intent. And if we really want to find the future is in everybody, not just in some of us. And that's really kind of what started it for us. And then we just kind of started doing what we said we were going to do through very difficult circumstances, and we're able to take 4 of them down with some significant difficulty.
Thank you very much. I think we've got a lot there that will spur some insights and some questions. I want to pose the same prompt to both Tracy Ann and Craig. And Tracy Ann, we'll have you take this up first. And both of you, if you could speak to your work, with the Bench by the Road project and how those kinds of inflection points led you into that work, and then how they perhaps inform the way you go about that work now. Tracy Ann, we'll go with you first.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to, before I start speaking, thank the Global Citizens Circle, and especially Bill Batson for rousing me out of a long winter's nap and getting me involved in such an enriching discussion. And thank you too, Ken, for agreeing to moderate. There are a number of things that make me think about the importance of monuments, but I have to say, in the past few years, I've been really struck by the impact and presence of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. That museum provides an immersive experience of African American life, history, and culture through artifacts and ephemera as diverse as slave ship logs, but also Chuck Berry's 1973 Cadillac Eldorado. And I only say this so that you understand that I am stunned each time I go by the contents of this museum, and for very different reasons. I'm stunned and floored by the collection at this museum. In the before times, when we were able to be around each other more easily, the museum hosted thousands of visitors every day, and many of them were school children. I would hear them buzzing about what they had seen and heard. I imagine that the impact of their visit is a deeper understanding of how integral African American history and culture is to the history of the United States. In other words, how it undergirds and informs US history and culture. And I can't say enough how lucky they are to have had that experience. I wish that I had had that experience. I wish that some former university students of mine who took very high level courses with me had had the opportunity to visit such a museum. It might have mitigated their confusion or their anger or sadness at not being exposed to the rich complication that is the history of this country. At the same time, a trip to DC is not possible for everyone. So I'm very grateful to serve on the selection committee for Toni Morrison Society's Bench by the Road project, which makes history come to life more locally. These bench placements have occurred across the United States as well as internationally, recognizing critical individuals or moments in African American history and culture. For example, there is one at the Library of Congress in recognition of Daniel Alexander Payne Murray, who was the first Black Assistant Librarian of Congress. He began his term in 1871 and served until 1923, 2 years before he died. Another bench recognizes the first self-governing community of freed slaves in Mitchellville on Hilton Head in South Carolina. That Mitchellville bench adds another dimension to the understanding of South Carolina's complex involvement in the slave trade. But the Mitchellville bench also sits within the Gullah community, and the local Gullah residents actually as well speak to the richness of African American history and culture in new and exciting ways every day. Quietly and deliberately, these benches become woven into the fabric of communities, the communities in which they are placed, much like the children who go to the NMAAHC, or the National Museum of African American History and Culture. These markers that are placed by the Bench by the Road project invite contemplation and wonder about the individuals and these moments that have shaped our communities. I cannot say enough how important it is for us all to see these markers that remind us of the complexity of the history of the United States. And I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have this morning about all of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. And Craig, if you could pick up also with your work with the Bench by the Road project and give us a sense of how you came into that work.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what Mitch was talking about earlier, and when you were mentioning transformative awareness and inflection points for somebody who is a white male. I am Jewish, but still I'm a white male, and that's a whole nother story about whiteness and privilege. And what I saw and what I've been privileged to be able to be part of as a young child, and also going to this from that point forward, I'm 52. So in the early 80s, I remember late 70s trips down to Independence Hall and the Betsy Ross House and all of the monuments and memorials in Philadelphia. And at that point in time, kind of wondering, well, why are we, and just on a very, very formative level, because this would take time over my life, but wondering why there wasn't a representation of African-American history or women's history or working class history, et cetera. You know, when I was walking around the beautiful architecture and the important built environment and architecture of a historic independence-oriented city. And those moments actually would turn into later, there would be a rebuttal, and the President's House, which was built in the early 2000s and still stands right outside of, as a monument right outside of Liberty Bell, is attempting to address the issue of Oni Judge and other individuals who were enslaved under George Washington, and the story of slavery, not just the story of these revolutionary figures or the early republic and the political and military history, white political and military history, because of course that also has African-American components of the early republic. And so there's been a bit of an address, a kind of a redress there. Another redress that I was noticing while I was growing up was that Charles Blockson from Temple University, and a very famous bibliophile, historian, the library at Temple University and African American Special Collections Library is named after Dr. Blockson, really led an effort in Pennsylvania to get state markers, African American state markers, focusing really, what's the word I'm looking for? Thoroughly represented throughout the city. And from the 80s and 90s to today, we do have kind of a changing landscape in the city of Philadelphia, with being able to understand stories and have everybody, you know, from kindergarten to seniors, as we often think of as public history, be able to go by those those places or former places and see those stories. And it was individuals like Charles Blackson that led those drives. Those were inflection points for me. They were inspirational for me. When I ended up going to grad school, Temple in the early 2000s had 2 kids on the way, went a little bit later than most individuals, graduated when I was 39 with my doctorate from Temple. I also had done my dissertation on W.E.B. Du Bois and Reconstruction memory. And in that dissertation, I didn't even realize at the time that I was not only talking about his academic history and revisionist history leading up to Black Reconstruction in 1935 and his seminal work, but also his popular culture, his work surrounding memorializing the Civil War and Reconstruction and rememorializing the Civil War and Reconstruction and re-examining what had been written about those eras and what had been neglected or had been disparaged. And so all of these pieces, I think, of my own kind of existence and my own process of learning, which continues to this day, led me to the Toni Morrison Society, a literary society that started this Toni Morrison Bench by the Road project. The Bench by the Road was their organizational motto because in 1989, Toni Morrison gave an interview to World Magazine talking about Beloved. And what she ended up saying was, and this is something that we often say, and Bill knows this from our NIAC bench placement, is she mentioned what she saw as a lack, as a dearth of African-American memorials. So she said, there's no place you or I can go to think about or not think about, to summon the presences of or recollect the absences of slaves. There is nothing that reminds us of the ones who made the journey and of those who did not make it. There's no suitable memorial or plaque or wreath or wall or park or skyscraper lobby. There is no 300-foot tower. There is no small bench by the road. There's not even a tree scored, an initial that I can visit or you can visit in Charleston or Savannah or New York or Providence, or better still, on the banks of the Mississippi. And because such a place doesn't exist, the book had to. So she was really figuratively and literally here. The society would kind of go ahead with the literal part, and she would be part of that vision. Take this idea of memorializing, commemorating, and honoring the legacy and memory of slavery, the institution of slavery and Reconstruction with Beloved. And then the society took that as their organizational motto as a literary society, and then in 1993, and then in the early 2000s, started this project and said, hey, maybe we can literally do this project. And their first bench was given to Miss Morrison as a ceremonial bench, which is really kind of the 1A, because the first bench that was physically placed would be at Sullivan's Island, South Carolina. Right after that, ceremonial bench given to Miss Morrison. And Miss Morrison was often at these events throughout her life. She loved the project. I often think that the fact that she was an editor and a professor and a writer and was kind of connected to this community of literary scholars really made it an interesting kind of living author society that you just don't get in many places. You know, the fact that there was that intimacy there with Miss Morrison and her work, and also her impact literally on the society. So I was brought in. I had these background kind of formative pieces. Another formative piece right after grad school was I worked for the state of Pennsylvania and the African American Museum of Philadelphia on a large scale study of Black history in Pennsylvania. And that was to look as a context writer for the National Park Service, a context study of Black history in Pennsylvania. And a big part of that was to have a template for state markers and for National Registry of Historic Places, properties. So again, for my own career, my own life, my own bias or privilege, this is how I've kind of been brought into this. And I lastly gave a link to Aaron. I don't know if you could put it up there, but just recently in Philadelphia, there was and this is, kind of the before, during, and after, in a sense, well, still during my work with the Bench by the Road project. This is not something to do with the Bench by the Road, but it's another important inflection point for me. And for, I'm sure, for many in the city, and me on a specific level, of course. But Octavius Catto, the memorial that was placed up in Philadelphia in front of City Hall in 2017, still stands. I don't know if you could scroll down there a little bit, Aaron, too. But other than having this incredible Reconstruction politician who was fighting for African-American voting rights and civil rights and equal rights, and was a Negro League baseball player, and just a cosmopolitan individual who died at a very young age, was assassinated because of his focus on civil rights. Right now, that memorial is so significant to individuals downtown in Philadelphia. People go to see it, to see the segmented trolley car behind Caddo, to see a ballot box that is actually in front of the memorial that speaks to the 15th Amendment. That's the last picture I think you're about to get to there too. That speaks to the 15th Amendment and the passing of the 15th Amendment. This has nothing to do with the Toni Morrison Society, right? This has nothing to do with the Bench by the Road Project, except it does have to do with it too, right? It has to do with it obviously in terms of memorials, and has to do with it in terms of the inflection points for me, and I think inflection points for changing the landscape of memorials in this country.
Thank you, Craig. Those are wonderful photographs there in that website. Would like to get into that a little bit more. I want to turn to Amiri now on this same question, and keeping in mind, of course, you've chosen to be very proactive and start to fill in public spaces with more of that kind of wider, diverse narrative. So that gives you this perspective of kind of leading the, if you will, this kind of newer charge to diversify that. Tell us a little bit about what brought you into that work, but then also what inspired you to sort of be the leader of that work.
Thank you, Kenneth. I'm so excited to be here today and see everyone, see so many great faces. We are building a memorial in America's oldest park, and one of the things that occurred in this year that all of us will remember. Last year was the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing on Plymouth Rock. And so when we think about what it means to be in the epicenter of displacement, we know a little something about that in Massachusetts. And so I wanted to take a moment before I begin, because we were building a memorial on the ancestral lands of folks, to read a land acknowledgement, particularly for us as King Boston. In this moment of racial reckoning, it's important to raise up our Indigenous siblings in this moment, as we are also raising ourselves up. So bear with me for a second. As we start here today, I'd like to acknowledge and recognize a fundamental truth, that we are gathered on the ancestral land of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts, also Nipmuc and Wampanoag peoples, whose land has been stolen and language lost due to colonization, disease, and forced dispersal. Their descendants continue to steward this land, and may we find ways in our work for justice and equity to center the decolonization of the Pawtucket, Nipmuc, Wampanoag, and Massachusetts people, as well as all Indigenous folks around the world. As we cannot gather in person, I'd like to invite you to also take a moment to consider the legacy of colonialization embedded within technologies, structures, and ways of thinking that we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. So I invite you to join me in acknowledging all of this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good on this time, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. I think this is an important moment for Boston. 2030 is the city's 400th anniversary. And so as we think about emerging post-vaccine, post-pandemic, Boston has an incredible opportunity to rewrite and reshape our values. Some of us call Boston the capital of down east, right? And so this reputation that our city has for both being a liberal Mecca, but also this history and acknowledgement and recognition of the racism that occurs in our city. This historic picture of Ted Landsmark getting stabbed by the flag, the sullying of Old Glory is the name of the picture, if you remember it. It was reminiscent of what we all saw and experienced on January 6th. And so Boston knows a little bit about racism. And so when we decided to build a memorial to honor the kings, we thought it was important to extend in this moment in time, as Mayor Landrieu said, to move beyond stone and steel, to understand that monuments have meaning, that they have values, and we wanted to be unapologetic to define what those values meant. And so this memorial in the center of Boston's oldest park in the historic heart of our city is also a memorial to 35 other African-American and civil rights leaders from the 60s. And so in Boston, the Boston Common, there's been a moratorium on building. And so we got a threefer there, a plaza to recognize one of King's final campaigns, the 1965 Freedom Campaign that occurred in Boston. We're recognizing 35 Boston civil rights leaders of the 60s, and we're honoring Dr. and Mrs. King. And so we're excited to have snuck three things in one, and through this process have created three memorials in this place. On top of that, we're also creating a community research center museum in Roxbury, which is the historic heart of Boston, the heart of our Black community. And so this 35,000 square foot facility is a museum, gallery space, and research center to interrogate the ways that Boston has been complicit in racism throughout our city. And then the last piece of the King Boston Holy Trinity is Embrace Ideas. And so if you can imagine, if the King Center is our Aspen Institute, Embrace Ideas is our Aspen Ideas. And I think as we're having these conversations, interrogating what memorials mean, we have to engage in spatial justice conversations. Where can Black and brown bodies be safe? Where can Black and brown bodies be represented? 1/3 of pre-contextual stops that result in the killing, state-sanctioned killing of Black folks happen during traffic stops. So can Black bodies be safe driving? This new phenomenon, which we saw clear over the last year, this Karen phenomenon, where Amy Cooper called the police on Alvin Cooper while he was bird watching. Can a Black body be safe bird watching? The other phenomenon we watch, can Black bodies be safe barbecuing? And so what does it mean? How has safety and well-being been an enemy of folks? How has it been etched in our minds around racism, both for white folks who see Black joy as a threat and for Black folks who are striving for the humanity and to feel safe? And so spatial justice is an important part of this anti-racist discourse. When we talk about redlining, we're also talking about spatial justice. Can your home be a place where you can be safe? And for Boston, which is a city that likes to punch above or thinks of itself as punching above its weight class, it is the 4th largest college town. 400 students come to Boston every year. The other college towns mark the population sizes of cities. New York is number 1, LA's number 2, Chicago's number 3, Boston's number 4. 400,000 students come to Boston every year. The Kings were a part of this cadre of students that came there during the 50s. And in an alternate universe, we imagine that Boston was a friendly city, that it was a racially just city. It was the city worthy of being the home of abolitionists. And the Kings, like many other Boston college students, decided to stay in Boston and made Boston the epicenter of the civil rights movement. Imagine what we would have been today in New England if Boston was that center. Well, that universe didn't happen. And so 65 years later, we have an opportunity to redefine what it means for Boston to be the epicenter of the anti-racist movement, of the decolonizational movement. We are on the verge of, some argue, this third Reconstruction. The first after the Civil War, the second after World War II, when returning GIs came up into the 60s. And this third Reconstruction, where we've seen Senator Warnock be elected. And in Massachusetts, we've seen Ayanna Pressley, and in Massachusetts, this never happens, unseated incumbent and really emerge as a national figure. In Massachusetts, our Attorney General is someone from the LGBTQA+ communities. In Massachusetts, in Cambridge and Boston, the Cambridge chief of police is an African-American, the Boston chief of police is an African-American, our subway chief of police is an African-American, our sheriff is an African-American, our DA is also a Black woman. Our next mayor will be a Black woman. And so we are a part of seeing the emergence of civic and elected leaders, policies. Boston, Massachusetts has passed through Charlie Baker, our governor, the first police reform bill in the country. So the civic and elected transformation that's occurring in our country, this opportunity to have conversations around economic justice that's occurring in Boston. And then lastly, I think as we've been sheltering in place, the one thing that we've all wanted to do is be together and embrace. And so the last part of a reconstruction is about the social fabric of a city. And so King Boston is existing in the moment of time where we are experiencing this third reconstruction, and we've been actively participating through our legislative and policy work, through our spatial justice work of building this memorial, as well as our arts and humanities work through Embrace Ideas.
Thank you very much, Amiri. It's deeply thoughtful. And I think we're going to have a lot of conversation around some of what you've just given us. We've got one more quick prompt for Mayor Landrieu that I think also will hopefully lead into the dialogue, because as you all know, the circle, the real heart of the circle is the conversation. So we want to throw it open very soon now to everyone and their own sort of questions and comments for the discussion leaders. But I want to ask Mayor Landrieu, before we get into that, you chronicle in your book the story of getting people on board with your project, right, to remove memorials and the long and winding conversation that was. I wonder if you might give us some lessons as to how to talk to skeptics of various stripes, some of them soft skeptics, some of them very hard ones. What kinds of lessons might you give to people who want to engage in that kind of dialogue with people in their own lives?
Ken, thank you. I don't know if I would contextualize anything I say by saying I'm giving people lessons. This is an area that is fraught with the deepest level of ignorance in how we actually talk to each other. You know, in this country, I always like to say that on the issue of race, everybody wants to either act like it's not there, or if they acknowledge it, they just want to get through it and go to the other thing. And I would offer to people that you can't go around this, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you really have to go through it. This is a painful fault line that has been laid out by my cohorts that has been with us for a very, very long time. And unlike what you just witnessed with trying to find a vaccine, where all the scientists in the world focused their attention on one thing and we gave them all the money that they needed and said, hurry up and get to the end. We've actually never done that with the issue of race in America. We did it with space. We just dropped something on Mars, but we've never ever said that this is the most critical issue facing the country, and we can't be who we are unless we deal with this. So let's figure out how to talk about it. So I would first observe that we don't know how to talk about this well. The second thing I would observe from the work that in my life and that EPU has done in talking to over 800 people for a half hour or 45 minutes, white people particularly are horribly uncomfortable actually dealing with this issue and hearing what it is that African Americans need them to hear and want them to hear, either because we are willfully ignorant or because somebody didn't teach us. So when I was talking to folks down here, and I was talking when I gave that speech primarily to a white audience, it's the only speech I've ever given in my public life, and I've given many because I've been in office for 30 years, where I was really directing my attention predominantly to white people in the South, mostly white men. So if you go back and read that speech from that context, that's who I was trying to talk to. And you'll notice about that speech, or one thing you could notice, is that's a very soft, inviting speech. The first 48 versions of that speech, there were 88, by the way, before it actually curated into what came out of my mouth that day, were very aggressive, very indicting, very fault-finding, very aggressive. And I stepped back for a minute after having thought about it for 2 years before I gave it, that I should actually try to invite people into a conversation. So Amiri, what you just said was beautiful. He said, I want to invite you into this space. I want to ask you to acknowledge with me. He asked you, he gave you an option. Would you please come? He didn't say, if you don't come, you're a racist and I don't want to talk to you. And so I started thinking about giving white people a way to say yes. And so there's a line in that speech. It was very intentional. It says, I want to invite you to look at history in a way. I want to gently peel your hands away from a misunderstanding of history that you may have learned. And one of the reasons I wrote that was because my mother, who's a saint, my mother had 9 kids in 11 years. She's gone straight to heaven. She said to me, I don't think you should take those statues down. And I said, well, why, Mom? And she said, well, because that's where my daddy used to take me to watch Mardi Gras parades. And all I remember is I said, well, do you know, I'll ask you the questions, went and asked me, do you know who put them up? No. Do you know why they're there? No. Do you know anything about it? For her, it had nothing to do with anything other than something she remembered as a kid. So when I wrote the book, she came back to me and she said, I assume that because you're my son and you wrote that book, that everything in that book is accurate. And I said, yes, ma'am, that I didn't lie. And she goes, that's good, because I'll wash your mouth out with soap. And what she said next was really kind of instructive to me. Again, the transformative awareness. I mean, sometimes you can walk by a lot of stuff and see it every day and not really see it. Like the homeless individual you walk by every day, are things. And so when my mother said to me, and now this is 80, at the time she was 83, 84, she said to me with almost tears in her eyes, she goes, all of that stuff that you wrote in that book about those monuments and our history, I did not know that. They didn't teach me that in school. I never understood that about the Civil War. Now, put aside for the fact that you can kind of let her off the hook. She's 83 years old, and you could have said, well, you could have learned it on your own. The point that I'm making is the entire history that we told people left out basically 97% of the people that lived in the United States of America. And so I started thinking to myself, how can you penetrate a person's psyche and awareness? And asking that question rather than telling them what they want to hear has been instructive. Now, having said that, let me be really clear about this. There are some people in this country that are not interested in seeing the truth or knowing the truth. And there's some people that are not going to give up what they know they have. And then there are lots of others that are just willfully ignorant. And then there are those people who are ignorant and they're realizing that they're ignorant and they want to be educated, but are now being said, don't make us waste our time educating you. There's a thing called Wikipedia. There's a thing called the internet. There's no reason for you not to remain, where you are right now. And so I think that those of us that are in this space have to start thinking about finding people where they are and then trying to get them, inviting them to come. And demand is a wrong word, but just saying this is where we're going and this is where the future is. And so this is about history. And I'll end here. But this is about history, but really what it's about is preparing ourselves for the future. It's really thinking about who we are as a country and what we want to become. It is about being right, and it is about accountability, and it is about recompense, and it is about getting somebody to acknowledge and say, I'm sorry, but not just for that. It's also to prepare this country for the future that we've never had. So when I say to people, so the great Isabel Wilkerson, who just has written so well on this, but her last chapter in Caste speaks to this issue about what we have lost as a country because of how we've been. My mind goes to, well, then what in the world do we have to gain? It would be unbelievable if we could get this right. And the idea that America hasn't even scratched the surface of her brilliance or her greatness by bringing everybody into, the growth of who we are as a people, to me, that's exciting as hell. And I agree. I think that we're in the third Reconstruction. The question is, you remember what happened after Reconstruction? Just don't forget that. So, Oscar Dunn, African-American, became the first African-American governor of Louisiana, not PBS Pitchback. He came second. And then we had lots of people doing lots of great things. And then the clapback came, right? So this is something that is not going to happen on its own. It's not going to be happen by itself. And it's not going to happen without people standing in this space saying, we demand the future that we all deserve. And that is the deeper issue to the symbolic monuments that we put up. We have to change, as Amiri reminded us, what's going on inside, what's going on with the policies, redesigning what the GI Bill should have done if it would have treated people well, what would have done if redlining would not have occurred, what would have been happening right now if the criminal justice system was not treating African-American people disparately, with the examples that Amiri showed us. All of those things underlie the depth and the immediacy of what's required of us going forward.
Thank you, Mayor Landrieu. I want to, at this point, think about moving into some of the questions in the chat. I just want to put a fine point on something that you were talking about, which is, and Amiri is talking about also this question of an invitation to a dialogue. You know, somebody who teaches the Civil War and Reconstruction and also the Civil Rights Movement to college students, that invitation is really quite important, and to do it the right way is fairly important. I'm always drawing the bright line for my students between blame and responsibility for these kinds of things, right? And so that kind of leads me to want to ask my colleague from Southern New Hampshire University, Elizabeth Richards, to ask of all of you the question that she put in the chat about engaging young people. Elizabeth, you still with us?
I'm here. Thanks, Ken. So like Ken said, I work with college students at Southern New Hampshire University, and certainly not all of them, but a frequent refrain that I hear is that all of this is ancient. They think 1980 is ancient history, right? All of this is a problem. I'm 40 years old. All of this is my generation's problem. We just need a new generation of leaders, and they're the ones who are going to do it. And they don't see race or sexism or heterosexism. And like all of this is just going to go away when all of us old people die off. And I struggle with how to get them to see that this is relevant, important, valuable. Amiri, I'm so grateful to hear from you and learn from you today, because, right, you're talking about like, this is happening right now. This is current in our backyard, an example of monument building. But I wonder, like, if you had an elevator pitch for a young person, right? What's your best advice for how to get them to care about history?
And that was to me. Ooh, that's
I'll
not
give
an
it
easy.
to anybody who will answer it. If
Yeah.
anybody has an answer for me, I'm so happy to take it.
You know, we have in our coalition building, we've started something called the New Boston Coalition, right? And so this idea of an invitation to folks to engage. And so the invitation to engage, at least from our perspective, that invitation has been extended to young people by other young people. And so we're fortunate where there is a foundation that has started something called Mlk Scholars. And so they give out 500 summer jobs every year. And so through that program, we're able to get those young folks who are really just engaging for summer jobs to lead the conversation and engage other young people to be a part of this dialogue, to make a decision around what Boston wants to be post-vaccine, right? And so like this, I heard this thing that said, was a joke. What do you want to bring out of the vaccine? And someone said, oh, I want to bring the mute all button with me out of the vaccine. So, you like in real time, you can just mute all. And so like, I think we've been using and engaging this monument. It's 22 feet high. It's 3 stories. I mean, it's big as hell. As an excuse and a reason to have a conversation with Boston during a mayoral election year, and really asking candidates to imagine what it would take to move out of the U.S. News and World Report from being the worst big city for Black folks to being the best big city, because that simple, jokey question is really about addressing all the issues that keep communities of color stagnated through racism. And I just want to piggyback what the mayor said earlier. I think the other way we've been conceptualizing having this discourse is, and if I'm proselytizing, please mute all me. Like on my road to a plant-based diet, what I have found is when I order from restaurants, everything is mostly meat. When I go to parties, when there was parties, mostly the buffet is filled with not that good veggie items. It's really hard for me to stay on this plant-based diet. I know intellectually that pigs and cows are sentient beings. I know that cows and chickens' bodies have to be manipulated to keep them in a constant state of pregnancy in order for them to produce dairy for cheese and milk and eggs for us to consume. I know that cows are bad for the environment, the methane gas that they produce. I know that pigs are smarter than dogs and cats, and we don't keep them as pets. I know that I could also get my protein from other things besides animals. That's kind of like being woke, right? And so as a woke white person, you see buffets of racism and white privilege everywhere. It's hard to stay your plant-based wokeness when every place you go is socializing you into meat eating, including the products that you're using to wash your hair. And so that's what we're all up against as white folks and as BIPOC folks. So Black folks are also striving for a plant-based diet. It impacts us differently, but we're also socialized by racism. We want to be in a plant-based diet too. And so we're given the same kind of circumstance where, I mean, there's a buffet of white supremacy meats in front of us that we can't resist. How do you deny your privilege when every time you move into another room, there's another offering of this? And so like with that as an understanding, how could you not extend an invitation to people who have been socialized by 400 years of racism in our country? Every damn one of us, it just impacts us differently. And so how do we strive for this wokeness? How do we strive for plant-based equity, right? Like if you can see how I'm mixing these analogies. And I think that has a lot of us as activists to not beat people up, not cancel people, to understand that white fragility is an epistemological fracture. It's like finding out the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and Santa Claus doesn't exist. You might be sad, you might be angry, you might be disappointed, right? And so like epistemological fractures are dangerous for all of us, finding out what we believe to be true or not true. We saw that on January 6th. We saw people going through epistemological headaches and storming a Capitol. So I think that's kind of how, at least the approach. And so I think also extending that to young people who are also being socialized into racism in the way that society socializes young people, and through technology and other things. And so I think engaging young people in this discourse to engage other young people has been a strategy that, at least that's what we've been trying to do in Boston. And we've found it to be effective. It's picking up steam.
Ken, can I pipe in here to give you the corollary of what Amiri said? He was using a lot of 25-cent words. You got 3 degrees. I was thinking, how you get 3 degrees from the same place? That's pretty good. And amazing. The analogy that he uses is perfectly correct. The insidiousness of race. It's in our bone marrow. It's something that we don't notice. We don't understand. And so this idea of inviting people into this space is really important. But I do want to, as we talk about young people, every generation says, all of y'all say it, we all sound like our parents. Man, the kids of today, you know what the rest of it is like. So the opposite of what Amiri was talking about was purposeful denial, intentional ignorance. So the 1619 Project I thought was brilliant, but President Trump jumps up and says, oh no, we're not doing that. We're going to do the 1776 Project, which is aggressive in the other direction. Tom Cotton and some of these senators right now with Merrick Garland, on the hutch, trying to be the Attorney General, they're asking him whether or not he believes in implicit bias. They actually are rejecting the idea that all of the work that we're doing is built on. This whole notion that there is racism in America is overtly, amazingly being challenged. They're actually trying to posit the possibility that the insurrection at the Capitol didn't have anything to do with race at all. Now, to all the white people on this call, ask you to consider, if you have not considered, that the insurrection from the perspective of an African American, like went and asked me to look at the monuments from their perspective. I know a lot of white Americans saw that and felt the assault on our democracy, but from the African American community's perspective, besides that, it was painfully evident that the disparate treatment or preparation that law enforcement did and handled as it relates to what happened with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, et cetera, all the way back, by the way, to Emmett Till. And it keeps going back further to as far as you can go. It just cascades. so many white people, it just passed them by right away, and they reject the notion that it ever happened. So when we say it's the third Reconstruction, what I'm saying to you is the clapback has already started. Last week, Georgia introduced legislation to suppress access to the polls. This is all stuff that those of us in the South have seen many times. And by the way, Amiri, thank you for recognizing Boston. When I was 15 years old, I came to Boston with my family, and I thought Boston was the great, wonderful place. We went onto a beach, and we realized that that beach was for white people only. And it was startling for a kid from the South who had been talked about like a dog to be up in the Northeast, and thinking, oh my gosh, I thought this was just relegated to the South. That was my first, when I was 15, I remember this happening. So as we get into this space in Boston, for example, if you have a mayor's race, you have a perfect opportunity to ask the mayoral candidates, tell me how you're going to position our city to make sure that everybody is included, everybody is invited, and we become the city that we brag to be. That is a way of getting something done, not the what. But the what is going to be hard, and the young kids of today are going to find out that this battle is going to go on, and they're really going to have to be the patriots and step up and get this done for us.
I'd like to jump in too. As a college teacher and in my classrooms, I tell my students all the time, don't believe history unless you see, or history, journalism, politics, unless you see multiple perspectives. Is your race, ethnicity, religion, sexual identity, is it represented? Is it represented both in textbook form and narrative form in the public history world, in the spatial world, in terms of spatial justice that we were talking about and Amiri was talking about as well. And I really asked them, how could we accept anything less? If we're looking at a history, we're looking at a story, looking at a narrative, we'd be disingenuous and not even objective, even though that quest is idealistic, if we're not going to see multiple perspectives, not just multiple perspectives, but also perspectives about power and how this country has been formulated and continuated on race relations and the injustices and inequity based on power on a number of levels, but race first and foremost. We often talk about Ken, you were talking about earlier, teaching Civil War and Reconstruction classes, and something I've done for a long time, and students wanting to constantly say, well, it's about states' rights, and I know Mayor Landry, this is something that, it's in your backyard every day too, and everything that you talk about, but, and many people here on this panel, it's about states' rights, it's not about slavery. And I'm like, well, you know what? The states wanted to have slavery in all of those states. The core, they wanted slavery to expand. The states' rights issue, even that they were talking about, which by the way is often hypocritical because it's often politically expedient. If it should be about states' rights, it's about states' rights today. It's about federal power tomorrow if it benefits, even if that was supposedly your ideology. The federal fugitive slave law is a perfect example of that, right? The support for having an intense federal fugitive slave law in the 1850s with the Compromise of 1850 by supposed states' rights Southern Democrats. This support shows A, the hypocrisy, and B, the fact that how deeply this is a racist issue and one that's transcended time. I also tell my students, and this is also what you just said a second ago, Mayor Landry, that don't think that that you're immune from this or that I'm immune from this. For who I am. A, look at the past 4 years. B, look at the fact that the Voting Rights Act has been dismantled in the last decade, and now we're even after the past 4 years, like you just mentioned, Mayor Landry, we're in this incredible backlash against Reconstruction again. With these intensive voter suppression laws, hundreds that are being pushed everywhere. And lastly, don't think that you as a liberal white person, and me as a liberal white person, so to speak, has it figured out or has it understood, or can't fall back into the same traps. That's a big piece, I think, for the well-intentioned white person. I say that paradoxically because I'm sitting here before you, saying that. But that idea that how do you not fall into that trap, of understanding that you have it figured out and be cognizant and realize that this is a very complicated issue that you need to be aware of and start trying to take on directly.
Tracy Ann, I want to think about what you were saying about bringing the benches to communities. where people who maybe otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to go to a big museum like in Washington and wouldn't have access to this kind of, newer way of thinking about public spaces. One of the prompts one of the questions we have in the chat, I was wondering if I could get Ruth to ask her question, and then if you might mind picking it up from there. Ruth, are you still with us to ask that question?
About the counter memorials, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, this has been absolutely wonderful. I'm in London. I'm a professor of anthropology, and for several years, along with my colleague Rachel Lair, who is also on the call, we've been doing ethnographic research into what are called counter memorials. The particular project we've looked at is called Strolpestein, stumbling blocks, which are small, like about maybe 4-inch by 4-inch brass plaques that are put on the pavement, on the sidewalks in front of the houses of people who were deported in the Holocaust. And it's been going on about 25 years. It was started by a German non-Jewish artist, and as a kind of way to acknowledge kind of collective guilt, I guess. And there are now more than 80,000 of these in 26 countries in former Nazi-occupied Europe. I know there have been some perhaps analogous projects in the South where lynchings took place, but I don't know if it's one organized project. And it's been in Europe, it's been very, very successful. And what it does, as opposed to a large, bronze statue that's in one place, people literally stumble across them when they least expect it. And it kind of forces them to realize, oh, wow, I have a child this age. And on each brass plaque, it says, the name of the person, the date when they were born and died, and what happened to them. Occasionally you see someone who survived, but usually it's the date of deportation to Auschwitz or Treblinka or so forth. Anyway, so it just strikes me as a alternative, what they're called counter memorials, counter monuments, way to reach many, many more people than would possibly take a one-off pilgrimage to, a larger statue. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, I had unmuted myself to jump in on the previous question. So I'm actually going to just start there and then go back to Ruth's question, if you don't mind, Ken. I wanted to piggyback on something that Craig said about the possibilities for the classroom. And we have a K through 12 educational system that is woefully bereft in terms of teaching young people about the history or histories of these United States. And it starts there. It starts in the home as well. But that doesn't mean that all caregivers need to know front, back, and all around the histories of the United States. But we pay into this larger system of education, and I think that it is possible. But I think one of the things that's very critical about education in the United States is that even at the most liberal of institutions, instructors are people too, and they don't want to come across as not knowing information. They don't want to come across in a way that seems that they are willing to look foolish or to stumble over the information. And that, I think, is a mistake. As a teacher, I would present the information to my students in classes, for example, on Toni Morrison's literature, but also classes on major American writers of the 20th century, and talk to students as if they too are experts on the literature. I'm the person putting the class together, but I don't have all the answers. And I think it's important to be vulnerable and to wrestle with the issues that arise when you talk about the events of the very complicated history of the United States. And I will also tell you that as an administrator, I'm doing the same thing. I was talking to a student recently about something that had nothing to do with the history of the country, but for the fact that the issue that we were talking about stems from some of the very racist tendencies that the United States has in place with regard to student aid, student access, and equity. And she very sheepishly told me that she was studying Black feminisms as part of her curriculum this semester. And I took the opportunity to talk to her about Black feminisms and to suggest text to her. And her whole demeanor changed. And she left the conversation feeling not only like more convinced that I would assist her with the thing that I was going to assist her with, but also feeling seen and heard. That's what students want. And I think that's what makes them take up the mantle of these things, that the history is not just dates and places and battles and things like that, but it's also like, how can I see myself in it? How is it not just about a blame game per se, but how am I part of this thing? How is it rich? How does it come alive for me in a way that is meaningful? And then how can I then take it and bring it to someone else? Because that's what it's really about. That connects very, very importantly to the issue of monuments, because if we keep monuments away from people, or we have monuments that are only recognizing people from failed insurrections from long ago, then we really aren't helping people to understand what their importance and significance is in this country. And I like the idea of a counter monument where people literally stumble over their history. Some of the things that I did in my classes was have students stumble over their history. I teach literature. I should tell you that my background is in literature. I live and breathe literature, fine. I freely admit it. But I let students stumble over history in those literature classes by letting them know, oh, by the way, like this novel is about the history of the individuals that were in the United States before whiteness and white supremacy took root. I'm talking about Toni Morrison's novel, A Mercy. And they're already in because they're reading the novel, but they might not have gone looking on their own for a historical text that explores this record. So I think in that way, we do have to place markers that people literally have to stumble upon, get hit over the head by, and place it where they are and not just away. There is something very profound about walking on the Washington Mall and seeing this amazing vessel emerging out of the earth, but not everybody can do that. So we have to go where people are. Part of that's starting with the schools, but part of that is acknowledging the blood and the sweat that people expended to have us all be able to be here, but also to acknowledge how very bloody the past is of the United States and what we're going to do now that all of us here know about it, or we have known about it. What are you going to do? Are you going to sit back, or are you just going to sit back, go get a coffee after this and like take it easy? Or are you going to go and tell somebody about the experience that you had? Are you going to share this, the recording with other people? Are you going to pull somebody aside and say, you know what, I heard that there was a person who led a charge here in this community, and I'm going to make sure that the local library has a program about it. What are you going to do?
Can I just add one quick thing here to that, to what Tracy Ann said, and Tracy Ann, thank you for that. But actually, what are you going to do when you're getting your hair cut, or you're in the locker room, or you're in the salon, and you hear people who look like you talking the way that we talk, and they're not really, what are you going to say anything? Or are you going to say, you know what, I'd rather sit in comfort, not be confrontational, but say, listen, that's not who we are. Brian Stevenson talks a lot about proximity, but there's a negative space that we're in, and we're all afraid because we don't want to be ostracized, and this is, by the way, this is true in the Black community and the white community. If you're in the barbershop and people are talking a certain way, are you going to talk up and say, that's really not who we are? Aside from what are you going to do civically, which is critically important. So as Tracy Ann said, it does start in the home. It's also in the church, it's on the playgrounds, it's in the locker rooms, it's everywhere where we go. And then when you get into the civic space, there has to be kind of a sense of not only where we're going, but we're talking a lot now about how we're going to get there. Are we going to rewrite the history books? Are we going to put up monuments? What are the pathways to inviting people into this space and telling the whole story? And I would just say this, and I'll say this in the sense of not knowing like we have all the answers. We clearly don't, and we don't really know how to do this. And the issue of speaking to fault and blame versus something like this. Listen, I'm not blaming you. I'm not saying you're at fault, because I know you're going to tell me that you don't know anybody that had slaves. I understand that. But is it possible for you to accept the fact that even though you did not know, now you do, and therefore now you have a responsibility to fix it? And do you accept that responsibility? That's an invitation. Look, the bus is leaving anyway. I'm just asking you if you want to get on it. It's not that the bus, you can't stop the bus from going where it's going to go. I'm just asking you to come. Do you want to come or do you not? Now that you know, what are you going to do? I think that's a really good question to put to people in a very thoughtful, provocative, but may potentially loving way. And that's a thing that sometimes has worked a little bit better than others.
We probably have time for maybe one more question in the chat, and then certainly some of us may be able to stick around a little bit afterwards. But very, very quickly, could we speak to? I want to ask if I have to find the right one here. Hold up for just a moment. Rick Mask had asked a question really early on about making history itself more equitable. Rick, do you want to bring that question forward for us?
Absolutely, thank you. And Mitch, good to see you again. Still got the signed copy of your book. Great conversation. Anyway, yeah, so, there's been comments made, and even I believe it was Elizabeth, also from Southern New Hampshire University, and she had stated, that young people, college age, learners at this point are simply saying, this isn't our problem, it's your generation's problem, so, everything will just be fine when all of you die off, essentially. That kind of mentality, it scares me, because I'm afraid that these young people are not interested in investing and understanding the inequities of history. And with Mitch's work of taking down statues, which I think is incredibly important work, and maybe the answer is something that Ruth gave about the stumbling stones, these counter memorials. What do we do to put in place things that can help this generation, these college level generation, understand these inequities of history and understand history was not equitable? I don't want us to get to a place where, as they say, when all of you die off, that we don't recognize these inequalities. And we do, to Mitch's point again, that we experience this clapback because there is no concern for those past transgressions. So like, what is the answer there? What is the solution to make sure these inequalities are still understood and we don't find ourselves in the same place?
That can go up to whoever wants to grab hold of it. So.
I was thinking, if, in terms of the public landscape, it's fairly direct from what we've been talking about today as an answer, which is that, I was thinking there's removal, there's staying the same, there's removal potentially of monuments that not only are Confederate, but could be racist or sexist, et cetera. There is also replacing monuments, right? And having new monuments, having new stories that are told. And some of those, have been there. I think we also have to be careful here again to realize we're not entirely reinventing the wheel, that African-American communities, for example, and not being African-American, but just speaking as a historical piece here, have been telling the story of African-American history even publicly for a century or more than a century, So how do we also make sure that those voices that have already been there as well are seen and heard and continued? This idea of revising the public landscape, the spatial landscape that is a place that is more equitable. I think back to when I mentioned early on today and talked a little too long, I apologize, about Caddo and the Caddo Memorial and what that means to people. When you go down to Center City, Philly today, and you see so many people taking pictures there's tangible pieces of that monument, of what it means to stand there with the figure that they didn't know had all this incredible history. They didn't know the story about Octavius Valentine Cato being a Reconstruction era advocate for political rights in the North in Philadelphia in the 1860s and 70s, being a civil rights activist in the city that pushed for desegregating streetcars, had these incredible stories of being this early Negro League baseball player. But now all of a sudden they know, their kids know, the kids who go to that monument know, they see it, they feel it, they see elements of that monument, from civil rights to voting rights to the power of that figure. I think coming full circle to our project, it's not new either, right? I mean, benches as memorials have been around for a very long period of time, in terms of a place to rest, a place to commemorate or memorialize an event or a person or some story. And I think Miss Morrison, with her brilliance, and then the society's initiative and action as well, wanted to take that figurative and literal, and really it's a combination of both even to this day, and have an actionable kind of item. And also, by the way, just to let you know, it's a community-based project. The communities themselves, and I think Bill could attest to this as well, in Nyack, the communities are the ones who develop these programs, develop I think in Nyack, Bill, the school district was involved in Cynthia Hesdra, which of course you were involved in helping retell the story of Nyack, as well as you have for many years, Bill, and the abolitionist stories of Nyack and the stories of African Americans in Nyack, and we kind of piggybacked on that. B, it was tied into a high school curriculum for the year. It was very actionable, and I think that when I think of these processes, I think that we do have to be actionable. I think that's really the right approach.
I think we're running close to time, and I know some people have to leave to go do some other things, and just want to take a moment to thank all of you for the opportunity to kind of moderate this with much to think about, and also lots of inspiration and advice stemming from, I think, this place of empathy that we need to instill in ourselves and in others, and then hopefully cascading that out into the worlds that we inhabit. And I just want to highlight, just as a historian, take this kind of moment to thank all of you, and to sort of reiterate something, Mayor, that you had said, that these monuments that we look at, these are choices. These are decisions people made to do something and not to do something else. They were not handed down from the gods, right? And they tell us about the people who put them up as much as what they're trying to memorialize itself, and trying to decouple that, what David Blight in his great book Race Reunion called the selective remembrance and the careful forgetting of the past, and to demonstrate for people that that's what's going on with a lot of these things that we're now addressing, and that we have an opportunity and an obligation as a citizenry to engage in our own confrontation with the past, and to try to tell that in a more inclusive and diverse way. So thank you all very much. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Bill to try to wrap things up for us. Bill, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I thank all the panelists for what they were able to share with us today, and the work that they will continue on as they leave. It was incredibly inspiring. I think there are opportunities around the country to get involved, and you've given us a great deal of information and many things to think about. So I thank you. As an organization that started with conversations around a dinner table, this is normally when the coffee would be delivered. So we're not asking anybody to rush off. We're hoping that if you want to continue and touch base with some of the many people. I think we had close to 100 people on the call, and it seems like a lot of people have hung around with us for this hour and a half. So please feel free to continue the conversation if you'd like. And Theo, are there any announcements for panels in the future, I guess people will just be part of our mailing list and we'll keep you informed.
Yes, thank you, Bill. I don't have any announcements at the moment for upcoming programs, but I would like to say that you all are, by virtue of registering for this program, you are in our mailing list, our email database, so that when we do programs in the future, you will receive an invitation. And we also will follow up this circle with an email that has a link to the entire conversation today that you can share if you'd like. And also this, the chat, which has some really great resources in it that people have been mentioning throughout the conversation. So I just want to thank everybody. This has been a really, really great conversation. And as Bill said, this is the end of the formal part of the program. So if you need to leave, please feel free to, but we're not leaving. So if you want to stay on and engage in some further conversation, we're here. You're welcome to. Thanks.
So Jerry, you got back from your bike ride.
You check my shirt, Bill?
I love it. I did. It's great product placement.
Yes, I did.
Does the informal mean getting another cup of coffee? Because I think I might.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I could use one. So Angela, yeah, so you saw that you foreshadowed Winton's arrival.
Isn't that connected it to the south of France, in the southwest, not on Saint Tropez side.
And I think his statue's secure.
I think
it's
so
not going
too.
Anywhere.
I think so too. It's been there that long. I can't, I was just surprised to drive through the countryside and come to that little village. And there it was. They have a huge museum for jazz. This is a French little village.
Well, that's historic, right? The Parisians in particular have always been kind to
this is the
American
Southwest.
jazz musicians.
Yeah, but this is where the Vichy was, right?
Wow.
I'm living in the Southwest of France, but a lot has changed. I mean, they tried. They still try. So we have a statue in Toulouse that was given to us in 2005 by the city of Atlanta. They gave us a phoenix to show the rising from the ashes because we'd had an explosion here. But I mean, that sister city agreement was made by the mayor, the first Black mayor of Atlanta, Maynard Jackson. You would never think that he would make a connection with another city in France, but he did. Because his mother got her PhD in Toulouse in 1933. Yeah, right? Small wonders.
So I see Michael Lockett has joined us. Thank you very much for your film, Michael. It started us off. It was much appreciated, well received.
Thanks, Michael.
Very welcome, very welcome. This was great. I'm glad I could be present for this.
I'm so glad that you were here, Michael, to be present for this. And I also want to thank you so much. You had very little time to put that video together, and you did just a heroic job on it. So much, much appreciated. And I know it was vacation week for your kids last week. So on top of work and childcare and vacation fun, we owe you big time. So thank you.
Thank you. I don't know when or how I could even call in a favor, but maybe this was it.
You know what occurred to me, Tracy Ann, what is the next bench placement? I know that I think there are two coming up.
Got two coming up that will be placed in Tulsa, all being well in April. And for reasons that maybe are obvious or maybe not so obvious. It's a very momentous anniversary, let's say. So we are commemorating in two separate locations significant moments during the Tulsa massacre.
And it's interesting that I really am happy that we're doing it before the memorials. So it's a bit understated. They're playing, it's part of how they're creating a pathway from the John Hope Franklin's Reconciliation Center to the Tulsa Memorial, and that's already there at the center of town. And they're doing a lot of kind of landscape architecture and also outside of a museum. I think one of them is going to be placed right outside of a museum that's currently being completed to the history of the Tulsa massacre. So it's pretty powerful, and we feel really thankful and privileged to be part of that process for them as part of the kind of partners in this project that they've been doing for many years, and just one more way of public art and memorialization to kind of express a way of thinking about the story, and from the perspective again of this project and Miss Morrison's vision and her idea, that's sort of something I think that we see in so many of these different cities, that there's that continuing element as well, or legacy to Toni Morrison and to her work. I think that's also kind of an added bonus to this whole project. I mean, it is something that lets her work and her memory and life live on as well. Her quote, her society, is at the heart of every one of these plaques. There's plaques and benches that are placed, that tell the story. And once again, we've done it at places that have already had monuments or memorials or state markers or national registers locations, and places that have had none of those. Well-known places and little-known places. This is obviously incredibly well-known. Nyack was a lesser-known story, in terms of not to your community, Bill, in Nyack, and to you and the historians trying to recover and to retell that story, and Lori Martin and so many others who've written about that story. But we've had them at the Library of Congress, at the Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture. And then lastly, there's a third bench that's going to be placed in April in Harrisburg. And so it's a lesser known story. It's for the Old 8th Ward in Harrisburg. It's right outside of the state capitol in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And the grand review of Civil War troops that happened after the Civil War in Washington, D.C. did not include African-American USCT troops. But in Harrisburg, it did. And Harrisburg was the first in that ward. I mean, there's so many stories in so many places. But one of the pieces that they're going to be telling there, and parts of the story that they're commemorating and memorializing, is that story. Is that story of the grand review of USCT troops that were included in Union Civil War troops after the Civil War as a celebration, and the first place to do it, and also in the African-American community, historic African-American community of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So there's actually 3 in April, 2 in Tulsa, I think April 20th, and then 1 in Harrisburg on April 27th. So for those of you local, that's not too far of a drive, but I of course want to be careful too. We're really, cognizant of the pandemic. Most of the folks who have been doing planning are looking at limited amounts of people, social distancing, much virtual, mostly virtual, at least a hybrid of virtual and in person at the very least. We had an all virtual bench placement in October in Cartersville, Georgia. So, we're still kind of playing around with that, and we want to be safe.
Thank you.
I was just wondering whether Benjamin Pogrund, who's with us from, who led a circle in Jerusalem in 2005, Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. I'm just wondering, Benji, whether you have any reflections, because there's so many parallels.
Yeah.
He was, yeah. Benji, you have to unmute your microphone.
Maybe Theo can, or I don't know who has.
Sorry. I'm sorry I came in late. I had to be somewhere else. But I've had quite a few thoughts, but I'm not sure what I missed. But one first point I'd make is, to my knowledge, this question of what little children know about the past is universal. It's common to Israel, South Africa, England, the three countries I've lived in, apart from America. And it's one of the great problems of the world, that too many kids grow up knowing very little about their country's history. The second thing is the stumbling stones are really, as you say, an extraordinary phenomenon. I remember once on one trip to Berlin, because of course you see them all over the place, and walking along, I suddenly saw a whole cluster of them on the pavement. And I was surprised, and I stopped and I studied the dates of birth, and I realized there must have been an old age home there. That's why there were so many stones clustered together. But they're a very effective statement and a reminder about the past. What I was thinking mainly, and I saw there was a question about this, a comment, and I don't know if it was discussed. It seems to me that there are a lot of offensive monuments around the world. There are a lot of monuments which are very beautiful and also mark parts of history which you can't eradicate. There was a slave trade, there were all sorts of things. And I often wonder, and I think this was done in that American city, Charlottesville, was it? They didn't take down the statue, but they put an explanation next to it to explain the historical background and significance. And that seems to me so much better way. I'm so sorry. Hello. I'll ring you back. Bye-bye. Sorry. That seems to me so much better, because you there have a statement about history, and then next to it, you keep it, unless it's so offensive that people simply can't abide seeing it there, and you put an explanation next to it. And I see this, for example, in South Africa. Cecil John Rhodes, who was the great imperialist. Rhodesia was named after him. And he was a freebooter, but he did extraordinary things. And the University of Cape Town owes all its wonderful grounds to him and a lot of his buildings. And up on the mountain is a wonderful Greek-type monument to Cecil John Rhodes. And it happens to be one of my favorite places in the world to go. You get this vista over the city. But a lot of people hate John Rhodes, Cecil John Rhodes. And the last time I was up at the statue about a year ago, someone had managed to hack off part of his nose on the iron, on the metal sculpture. And I thought, what a pity it is, because what are you going to do with this? You can't destroy that monument. It's simply too beautiful. It's one of the great features of Cape Town. And rather keep it and put up a proper explanation which explains who Rhodes was and what his context in history was and where he was wrong and whatever it might be. And I don't know if this has been scouted at all in the discussion this evening. As I say, I saw someone refer to it. And of course, in this part of the world where I live now, history is potent. We don't just go back to the Civil War, we go back a couple of thousand years to biblical times, and there's all sorts of controversies. I dealt with this in a little bit way a few years ago on two occasions, because history is disputed here. So what three of us did, Palestinian and American and me, we got together an equal number of Israelis and Palestinians. I think there were about 14 each, including a number of distinguished academics. And we chose themes like 1948, the war. And we asked academics on each side to write their view of that war. And they were totally different. And we put them side by side. And it was hugely illuminating. Now, I happen to disagree profoundly with the Palestinian view of that war. But reading what my Palestinian colleague wrote gave me a huge insight into Palestinian suffering and why people feel as they do. I don't know if that's a technique which helps this sort of discussion in any way at all, to look at from different angles at the same event in history, and that it tends to illuminate it. I don't know if any of that is of any help to you.
Thank you.
I did, by the way, recently see on Netflix, it was a famous actor called The West. And I was startled. I thought I knew a little bit about American history, but I was startled at the detail I learned there about how the Native Americans were treated and dispossessed of their land and of their food. And that was, I don't know if any of you saw it, was it Robert Reddill or somebody? I forget his name, well-known actor.
I'm just wondering, Tracy Ann, I feel like you would have some insight into responding to Benji's requests. And Benji, if you would mute yourself, because each person, if you mute your microphone again so that Tracy Ann can speak. If you're willing to, Tracy Ann.
I mean, it's funny, I keep the questions in my head that people asked previously. So there was a question, I think, by Paul about how to deal with monuments and how to proceed and so on. And I think that that's very important, because there are many people who feel that we should just destroy them. And we saw a lot of that over the summer after the murder of George Floyd. Quite a number of individuals just ripped down statues. And perhaps controversially, I don't think that we should just rip them down and destroy them. I think that they should be relocated. I don't know what that means, if they should be relocated to a quieter place, a less traveled place, if they should be put into a museum. But I liked what Paul reminded me of, that there is a controversial piece at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And it has information, and that's what we need to do. We need to provide information and context for why we have, or why it took so long to address the history that would allow, let's say, an individual who performed gynecological experiments on African American women to be prominently displayed in Central Park for many, many years. And then the explanation for that is that, well, we don't really put up statues about people anymore. We don't really put statuary in Central Park, but we have this statue, and this statue is problematic. So what can we do to address that? Do we just pretend he didn't exist? Because that's very dangerous. And I'm saying that that's dangerous because if you are someone who came of age in the 2000s, you might think that the election of Barack Obama ended racism, because that is what the cover of the New York Times said the day after the inauguration. Beautiful picture of the Obamas and their girls in black and red, and Michelle Obama's wearing one of her amazing dresses, and racism is over, evidently. And so if you don't have the context of history to tell you how we arrive at this person becoming president, then you miss the point of the history. We have to have these statues somewhere. We have to have this history somewhere, and it can't just be in books, because folks aren't always going to books now. We have to, so it goes back to my argument earlier that we have to meet people where they are. We have to the stumbling blocks that Ruth was talking about earlier, her very important project that we discussed earlier. We literally have to find people where they are so that they can stumble over it, so that they might rest on a bench, for example, and maybe as they're settling back, they realize that there's a little plaque there, and they turn around and they realize that a woman named Cynthia Hesdra was part of this community, and that she had a larger influence beyond what you might know. Or, for example, in my own backyard here in Peekskill, New York, which is in northern Westchester County, sharing space. Like Peekskill has a whole campaign. There's signs all over that Peekskill is a friendly town, and it's part of a campaign from the early 20th century. But right underneath one of the postcards from that time period is a statue that we are borrowing of Harriet Tubman. And it is stunning and fascinating for Harriet Tubman to be a part of our community at this time, in this moment. And it's called Harriet Tubman Journey to Freedom. And it's Harriet Tubman saving a child that might be one of her children, or might just be a child that she knew. The child is named. But the fact of the matter is, this statue is in the center of town, right by our restaurant row. So even though we are socially distancing, even though we are in our homes, even though we're not supposed to see each other, people see it every day. It's in a main thoroughfare, and people are stopping. And how do I know that? Because the snow is disturbed all around it. And you can see that people are stopping and looking and touching it. You can see where people's footprints are sort of sliding into it, so that they're really connecting with this work. And Peekskill, for those of you that don't know, was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Ward Beecher lived here. His was a stop on the Underground Railroad, as were prominent African Americans who lived at that time. And his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote part of her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, here in Peekskill. But people don't know that. And people don't know that who live in Peekskill. And that's part of the work that has to be done. And so when I said earlier, what are you going to do? Part of it is talking and saying, hey, did you know that, like, in this area, this little creek down here that you're hiking on, did you know that this was part of the Underground Railroad, so that people could pass through here and get to safety? Like, they would deliberately pass through this line of water, so that if there were any slave catchers tracking them still, that they wouldn't be able to be tracked anymore, because their scent would have been eliminated by the water. So that's part of the work I think that we have to do. And it is daily, it is hourly, it's minute by minute, but I think it's necessary. I don't think that it has to be angry work, but I do think it is insurgent work. And I think that we all have a responsibility to do it.
Yeah, Nadine, I was thinking about the impetus for Mitch Landrieu's removals, and I think it was an extended part of that interview that Michael excerpted for us. It was around the time, it was after the murders in the AME Zion Church in South Carolina, and that was a moment when people finally committed to doing something that had been talked about for a very long time. So we're talking about the physical space, but really these are kind of we're debating concepts, and obviously how we view ourselves is made manifest by these sculptures. But the inflection point of those murders at the 9 African American worshipers being killed in church at a Bible study, and by a person who was a self-avowed white supremacist who glorified and revered the Confederate flag. So that was a tipping point. And then the George Floyd murder was another tipping point. So obviously we have these, it seems almost like American history recently has been about these violent pendulum swings. And it seems like the inflection points are getting closer together, and the arc is getting closer. Maybe it will get to a still point, or maybe, I don't know, the pendulum breaks at some point. But I find the way that Amiri spoke about, the land, ultimately the land is here throughout all of this, and it sometimes laughs at us and it's mocking us, and it's here, and the original inhabitants of it could probably give us a great deal of instructions on how we go forward. But the oldest, I just find that there's just such great poetry, and the oldest park in Boston is now going to be welcoming this Martin Luther King statue in a city where he probably didn't feel ever comfort. When I was in Boston, and it was really always around the New England Circle, I remember, marveling at his time there, but also missing any evidence of his time there. So really kind of this question of spatial justice is really, it's a great way of phrasing it. And that's what all these projects are about. It's about spatial justice. And, certainly we have to, moderate how we make these decisions, because there's something, you don't want the presence of the monument to be violent to anybody, but you don't want the removal of it to be violent either. I mean, it really is one of the other things in the chat that Amiri put in there was, it is about love. So, you know, if we can be kind in these questions, and certainly being insurgent as well, and being, you know, being taking, you know, this seriously, and especially these times. But these projects, all these projects are just so important, and they just bring us forward so lovingly.
I wonder if anybody knows of, if anybody here knows and can comment on the statue in Boston that was taken down just fairly recently, the Emancipation Statue. And I think somebody probably thought it was a good idea. It's a statue of Lincoln, but at his feet is a slave with his hands, with his arms raised to Lincoln. And there was a movement against that. And
yeah, there's a book. It's by let me just get the author. Kirk Savage. That's called "Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves." And it's about, like, you know, it's also about that piece of monumental history as well. And even, again, that's the well-intentioned part too, right? Like, what are the supposed well-intentions, at least, potentially? Because, you know, who knows the actual intentions, but the reality of creating a monument that says, okay, we're talking about an important and meaningful moment in history or people in history, but how are we doing it and who's doing it? So I think that's what was discussed there. I was also thinking with projects that I do in Germantown, this goes back to Benjamin's question earlier too, when you're talking about South Africa and the long history. I mean, we have a long history in this country too, and Mari talked about that earlier. I mean, with Native American history and going back thousands of years as well. And how do we redress Native American history here? And, you know, Bill, you were just referring to that too. And in Germantown, where I'm doing a few projects, they're looking into Lenape Indian, or is also known as the Delaware Indian tribes, their Great Road, you know, and looking at, you know, I mean, we probably don't do that. We don't do that story enough, period, in terms of memorialization, commemoration, just in our textbooks, just in a general narrative. B, we do it less in the East, right, than we do in the West. It's often thought of as a Western story. What about the East? Not only those who remained behind, but those who actually went West, if they did survive smallpox or violence or whatever else happened, or, you know, the back and forth combat that happened between colonists and other Native American groups. And so I think redressing those issues here is critical and is important moving forward too, and being actionable on so many different levels, intentional on so many different levels. And lastly, I wanted to get back to what I see a little bit as, again, paradoxical. I overuse that word, but this issue of removal of monuments, and Tracy Ann, you just talked about it too, and Benjamin, you mentioned it, you know, versus, you know, I think that's the one category I left out when I talked about, okay, in fact, I forgot to put that fourth category in, which was not just removal, not just staying the same, removal, or putting up something new, but another category is keeping it and telling a new story, right? Or telling it with context. But then I also think about the converse to that, like what happened in Nazi Germany after the war, and the fact that you don't have memorials to Hitler or to the Nazis in World War II. You know, you have, in fact, if anything, you have more, if not all, memorials, public memorials, that are centered around those who were survivors or those who were killed or abused or tortured. So I think it really is a complicated story about, you know, again, after George Floyd, the removal of monuments even to colonists in England or colonial powers in England. I mean, there's a lot of power in that too. You know, that kind of, you know, I guess it's sort of like a righteous anger to kind of take it down, but it does, you know, kind of come full circle, Tracy Ann, to what you were talking about is, and Benjamin, like, how do we also reconcile that? You know, how do we reconcile that need for removal and redress, and what's the right approach moving forward?
Can I ask a question? I just the mayor talked about clapback, the Trump, the Trump and the Trumpism being a clapback, and I'm just hoping that there's no clapback, with erecting these monuments now to African Americans, because we have seen over the years how the Emmett Till Memorial has been vandalized and shot up and I'm hoping that that the clapback does not doesn't extend to these new and wonderful monuments that we're trying to put up to to commemorate African Americans.
I mean, it's a great question because we're talking about public space, and the Emmett Till Memorial that you just mentioned, and constantly being shot up is a good example. It's a scary but real thought moving forward.
Well, yeah, I just think, when you're, especially in the civic space, you have to model what democracy looks like. So, if you want to make it to Congress, you don't assault a Capitol Police officer with a flag to get in. You make an appointment or you run an election. So in the same way, if you want a sculpture down, you engage stakeholders in a decision. It's almost more powerful to do it that way. And certainly there are moments when, there have been kind of emotional expressions of protest. But in hindsight, I think just moving forward in a way that is going to construct a country where there is equity and where there is justice, I believe we have to model the behavior that we would expect to see. It's almost like the protest movement is as massive as it got and as powerful as it was guided by such incredible precepts. Like in the letter from Birmingham jail, before a direct action campaign was undertaken, Dr. King suggested that people engage in research and then negotiation and then self-purification and then action. So I think in the same way as you're evaluating what to put up or what to take down, I think there has to be, a kind of sanctity to it. If it's going to be something that's going to be valuable to the community and valuable to our progeny and respectful to our ancestors.
Can I just say a couple of things? Just responding to something that Alicia said and Craig. Am I? Oh, yeah. Am I mute? Can you hear me? Yeah. Craig, when you were just saying mentioning about the post-World War II monuments in Germany, it's not as pretty a picture as you make it out to be. Actually, there's some very problematic statues in German. There's a word that means both sacrifice and victim. It's the same word. And so there's some statues to the victims/sacrifices of the war, and that are very Christian, with pietas and so forth, and that have been seen by different constituencies in different ways, shall I say. And just, there was not a National Holocaust Memorial until about 50, 60 years after the war, because they couldn't agree on if there should be one and what it, and then Alicia was mentioning the concern about vandalism, just which is a very real concern, but for the Strolpestein that I work with, there's been a lot of vandalism. I mean, most are not vandalized, but there's been continual vandalism. Neo-Nazi groups come and dig them up, and then the artist, for every stone that's vandalized, he will come and reinstall a new one, and there's another ceremony, and it's made, and in a way, the more vandalism there is, the more attention they get, and it becomes a learning experience. And many of them are, I mean, in a way, it's analogous in some ways to the benches, in that they are, not formal, traditional, men on horse type statues. And the benches are fabulous. They invite passersby to participate and to sit and to reflect, and why it's there. but I'm sure they're quite expensive. The Strolpestein cost just a bit over $100 each. And many of them are put in as school projects. And the school, like a classroom of 10-year-olds will do research on who used to live in my neighborhood. Let's find out. And they do the research, they raise money for the at bake sales, they look to see if there's any living descendants of the Holocaust victims and so forth. And yes, sometimes they are vandalized, but that again is transformed into a learning experience. And just the last thing I wanted to say, I think it was Tracy Ann, I don't know if she's here anymore, mentioned about removing statues. A couple people have mentioned, do they stay? Do they get moved? What do we do with them? Do we recontextualize them? I've lived for several years in the former Soviet Union, and probably many of you have seen these iconic statues, pictures of Lenin statues, being toppled. And every town in the former Soviet Union had a statue of Lenin. There formerly were statues of Stalin and the head of the KGB and others as well. And they all had to make decisions what to do with them. And they've all come up and many different responses have been attempted. One city I lived in decided to have a kind of a new statue park. So all of the statues in the city were gathered and put outside the city in a new statue park. So you had to, and recontextualize that way. Other people were very upset when their own Lenin statue was taken down, because they said that's erasing our history. And even though, we suffered, we don't want it to erase our history. We just want to recontextualize it. There have been some very amazing art projects, some conceptual art projects dealing with it. So, so when you're thinking about it, it's might be useful or helpful, interesting at least, to compare how other places in the world have dealt with similar things. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. That also reminds me of the standing soldier, kneeling slave idea. This potentially well-intentioned, but then what's it really saying? It's still maintaining power. The memorialization you're talking about. So thank you for that information.
Well, everyone, we have been on for quite some time, and it has been a rich conversation. I want to thank everyone again for being here, for staying on. There's always great discussions that happen after the formal part of the program, so I appreciate all of your questions and comments. And Craig, thanks for staying on right to the very end. But I am going to, as the president, take the prerogative of calling this meeting to a close.
I second the motion.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks. See everybody.
Thank you, Theo. Good to see everyone. Bye, Nadine. Hey, Craig.
Bye-bye, everyone.